For the France 24 debate, and it's Friday, and for the next hour we'll be taking a look back at the major news events of the week. My panel of journalists includes Samir Aita. He's the chief editor of Le Monde Diplomatic's Arab edition. Joining us from Radio France Internationale tonight is Billy Okademere. He's their Africa specialist, and Anne-Elisabeth Moutet is a correspondent at the British newspaper The Sunday Telegraph. Many thanks indeed to you all for being with us tonight. Straight then to our first subject, and it's been a week of dreadful economic news on both sides of the Atlantic, and no surprise then that this week brought the worst sell-off on global markets in 2 years. $2.5 trillion have been wiped off the value of global stocks in just 1 week. Here's the past 5 days on the US and global markets. Well, in the US, there were signs of slow economic growth coupled with a tough austerity plan that apparently pleased no one in Washington. Well, here in Europe, meanwhile, we saw the biggest signal yet that the debt crisis is on its way to Italy and Spain, and even France isn't safe. Today, the CAC 40 extended a 10-day losing streak, a sell-off that hasn't been seen since the index was created back in 1987. Well, unsurprisingly, officials in Brussels are frantically trying to contain this crisis. Let's have a quick listen to Commissioner Olli Rehn speaking this afternoon.
You may recall 2 weeks ago, the euro area leaders reaffirmed their commitment to do whatever it is needed to ensure the financial stability of the euro area as a whole and its member states. The political will to defend the euro should not be underestimated. Since the onset of the crisis, euro area leaders have always proven that they could take the necessary decisions and do so in a continuously evolving situation.
Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, I'll start with you, if I may. Olli Rehn, they're saying that the will to defend the euro should not be underestimated, but what we're looking at today seems to be a battle that's already being lost.
I don't think it's a battle that's already been lost. The market crash, there have been market crashes in the past, there have been worse market crashes 20 years ago, and the currency was not in question at the time. Also, it is very obvious that the market crash right now is much more triggered by the strange agreement that was finally reached at the last minute in America, much more than any new developments of the debt crisis in Europe. So there's, it's not easy, but I don't think it's over yet.
But investors seem to be saying, when we look at the markets over the past few days, that European governments, much like banks a few years ago, are not able to manage their economies. They're not debt worthy, they're not credit worthy. That seems to be a huge loss of confidence in European officials about how to handle this.
The question is, does Europe need more of a federal economic governance, or does it need more decisions by government? You've got the Eurozone on the one hand, and the Europe, the wider Europe, the 27, on the other hand. The Eurozone needs more action by the European Central Bank, but that, I think, is something that Monsieur Trichet is decided upon, and there has been concerned the French-German axis by and large has worked together on this. It has not, it has not faltered yet. They voted subsidies to Greece. They voted to help Greece reschedule its debt over 30 years. I don't think it's, if you don't lose your cool, I don't think it's yet going to be the situation in which the euro falters entirely.
How worried should we be about Spain and Italy? We saw that borrowing for them became much more expensive this week, and there are signs even that France could end up being encompassed by this debt crisis. We're not talking about the periphery anymore, we're talking about the central states, and we're going well beyond the pigs, the Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and it's, we're in the midst of a crisis. I don't think right now the question is what will the investors buy? If they do no longer buy shares, normally they would buy government bonds, but they say it's impossible to buy government bonds because we can't rely on those bonds. So they almost sort of stand on either some of them have been shorting these governments, and like George Soros in 1992, they're hoping that the countries will default, but that's not the majority.
actually, Soros himself has said that the euro should be defended. I don't think he's the main actor now on those markets. But I think all of this was really triggered by the American crisis. And strangely enough, the American crisis is actually, it's not good for Americans. It's promising Americans slow growth because of this austerity the program that they have enforced and the fact that they don't want to have another large stimulus. But what's really interesting in that is basically the Americans, instead, like the previous times, of passing the buck, i.e. of creating currency and by and large paying half their debt by inflation, are now saying, no, we do not want inflation. So instead of having European investors or Chinese investors pay for the American crisis, they're saying we want to pay for it ourselves, in effect. That is the gist of what the Tea Party is demanding, although I'm not sure they're conscious of it.
And of course, the big story of the week in the States was that a compromise deal was reached in Washington. Let's take a listen to President Barack Obama, who spoke earlier today when some US jobless figures came out. And here's what he had to say, again expressing his displeasure, if you like, with that deal reached earlier this week.
The bipartisan compromise on deficit reduction was important in terms of putting us on sounder fiscal footing going forward. But let's be honest, the process was divisive, it was delayed, and if we want our businesses to have the confidence they need to get cash off the sidelines and invest and hire, then we've got to do better than that. We've got to be able to work together to grow the economy right now and strengthen our long-term finances.
And analysts are saying, aren't they, that this deal was the worst of all worlds, that it's cutting spending at a time of economic hardship, but it's not really addressing the long-term problems of restructuring American debt.
Exactly. What worries me is the long-term effect. Can we solve a debt problem with austerity programs and letting the people pay while reducing the taxes? Which means only the poor people paying the things, not the banks, not the rich. This is like quadrature du cercle. It means you cannot never solve this in the United States and in Europe. But the second effect is much more important. If you reduce the taxes and you put austerity, you can somehow hinder democracy. It means democracy is based on people paying taxes and asking the government to be accountable to them. If you reduce the taxes and if you put austerity and you have no really growth-driven programs, what will happen next? Means you can have troubles with the tea parties, with etc., and have put in danger the whole democracy in some countries of Europe, but maybe even in the United States.
But one could argue that it was democracy that put the Tea Party in Congress, these Tea Party candidates in Congress, and this has been deemed a big victory for the Tea Party this week, hasn't it?
Yes, but somehow ideology don't follow always logic, which means in the United States. You have people who want to live in each area like they are alone without having any care about the federal state and about redistribution, while the basic function of a state is to solve problems of hunger or whatever and redistribute between different parts of the society to make infrastructures.
To promote growth, isn't it? I mean, the argument is that if America continues to pile up these huge debts, record levels of debt, it's going to harm growth in the long term.
Yes, and growth is infrastructures, is investing in high tech, like what always the US has been doing. It's social policies to solve problems with industries moving to other places of the world, and etc. And nothing like this seems to be happening.
I would correct this a bit, because actually the thing about America is high-tech invests of itself. It doesn't need the government help to invest. Infrastructure is not
completely true.
Infrastructure is not in America. I mean, the stimulus in America comparatively did not invest in infrastructure. Most of the money was used to either prop up ailing companies like General Motors, which was in effect propping up unemployment and preventing unemployment, but the rest was spent largely to give a bit more means to consumers. And what they do is they buy stuff that is mostly manufactured in China. So what it did was really to damage the trade balance a bit more. Whereas if you take the stimulus in France was at least partly spent on infrastructure, on high-speed train lines, on motorways. President Sarkozy said that even though it's costing us right now, at least once the crisis is over, we'll still have the high-speed train. But all that will remain in America are some
Nobody's
sort of out-of-date Blu-ray DVD readers, which is a bit of a problem.
Yeah, but just on the argument of the American federal government investing in high tech, take the proper example of car industries. And when the U.S. car industry was in trouble 5 or 6 years ago, and how the American government declared that any research on car improvements and will be paid half by the government. And there was a huge amount of money put in the industry in a controversial, in a diverted way. Of course, they don't play, let's say, Keynesian politics like we still do in France.
Spending to get out of a recession.
Yes, spending directly. But here it's indirect spending through the huge complex of research depending on the DOD and whatever.
One thing a lot of people agreed on was that Barack Obama came out of this very damaged. Do you think this might have harmed his chances for re-election? Has he been seen as weak?
I'm not so sure. I think the American public have generally been watching politicians on both sides of the divide, and if they are going to apportion blame, I think it will be equally shared. In this stage, the mere fact that they managed to pull it off at the last minute, the beauty of the whole thing notwithstanding, and the damage it has caused notwithstanding, I think he comes a little bit looking the leader in difficult times. I don't think I can say that about some of our leaders here in Europe. They are on holidays. This crisis is unfolding.
Who are you talking about specifically?
You would imagine all of them to be rushing back, calling emergency cabinet meetings, but they are still enjoying themselves. When in just one day you hear that almost 50 billion pounds has been wiped off the British Stock Exchange, the FTSE. So I think Obama still comes out looking good. He is trying to be there to provide the public face of leadership, talking on a day like this, while some of our leaders are just missing in action.
What about American democracy? Do you think the reputation of how the political system works in the United States was damaged in the eyes of the rest of the world this week?
Exactly. Perhaps also in the eyes of some Americans, because don't forget that Americans boast in the value of their democracy, but at the same time, they always don't stand back and in retrospect say, well, perhaps we are wrong in doing certain things. They vote in their leaders, of course, which is their right to do, but after the damage is done, then they try another set of leaders to try and correct it. You remember the way they voted for George W. Bush, and by the end of his tenure, very many of them believed that he was such a disaster. Perhaps by the time this is over, they will think that the Tea Party is such a disaster, or even Obama is a disaster.
What are your thoughts on that, Anna Elizabeth? Do you think who's been most damaged by this politically?
I think he's been damaged. I think basically he has been criticised by both the left of his party and the machine of his party, I mean the grassroots of the Democratic Party, for yielding too much, and he will not gain any traction with the other side. So I don't think it's helping him. And the other thing is that this is almost a guarantee for sluggish growth at best and deflation at worst. And the election is next year, and it will come at a time when unemployment is not better. It will come at a time when the economy is hurting. And so I don't think you can be elected, whether you're left wing or right wing. I don't think you can be elected when you've got such fundamentals sort of going downwards. So I think his goose is cooked.
What about the idea that this is just another step in the direction of the West squandering its economic dominance, if you like? I mean, we heard China and Russia really criticise the US over this week, saying, look, you can't do this. You can't hold the world economy to ransom like this. Do you think this is just another sign that the West is losing that dominance, and China and other countries are gaining dominance?
Yes, of course. One could argue that China has a central management of its economy and playing strong state interventions in some areas and etc. But going to some democracy, which will come inevitably. While on the other hand, one could wonder if the type of Congress and which has been elected lately could really handle the problems that America is living, which means never, ever in the history of America there was so much money put for electing each of the congressmen, etc. This is a first in American history.
You mean in terms of
means it's
political campaigns or lobbying?
Party finance and candidate finance.
Oh, so
it was huge money. So these guys represent interests of companies, of the people who paid for the elections. It's more companies than, let's say, simple citizens. So how can they be somehow independent to take their whole country interests above the company who financed them interests?
Well, I agree that there's a growing perception globally that there is an economic shift, the shift in the economic fundamentals to the east. Two of the three most powerful countries in economic terms in the world are already in the east. And China has managed to come this close just in under 20 years. So, but I think China also believes that it's in its own interests that the American economy stays strong, and the European one as well. That's why they have been making some noises today or yesterday about their concerns about what is going on in Europe, but they will back a stronger European economic economic situation jumping out of this. They themselves feel it's something rather temporary.
Okay. Last word on that very quickly, Anna.
Make the point that China is about 8% of the world GDP, that Russia is 2% of the world GDP, that America is 25% of the world GDP, and that Europe is 37% of the world GDP. So if you look at cold figures, those countries haven't got there yet.
So America and Europe doesn't need to be worrying yet. Not quite yet.
Not
All
quite
right.
yet.
Okay, hold those thoughts then. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll be talking about a worsening crisis in Somalia, where this week officials in the US said that some 30,000 people have died in the last 90 days, most of them children. We'll talk about that crisis in a few moments. Stay tuned.